Texas Baptists Committed exists largely because of courageous Baptists here in Texas who 25 years ago determined that Texas Baptists would stay free of control. They are heirs to a rich tradition of those who, since before Texas became a state, rooted Texas Baptist life in historic Baptist principles and risked life and livelihood to keep Texas Baptists free and faithful. In focusing on just a few of the many Texas Baptists who have made a difference, there's no better place to start than George W. Truett, pastor of First Baptist Church Dallas from 1897 until his death in 1944, and namesake of the theological seminary that stands today on the Baylor campus. The 1936 book, Centennial Story of Texas Baptists, tells us that as a youth, Truett joined in a campaign to save Baylor University from the auctioneer's hammer and secured nearly $100,000 to save it to future generations. He afterward entered Baylor as a student. Truett, a powerful and stirring preacher, served terms as president of both the Southern Baptist Convention and the Baptist World Alliance. In May 1920, the Southern Baptist Convention held its annual meeting in Washington, D.C. During that convention, as Brent Walker writes in his book Church-State Matters, Truett spoke to an estimated crowd of some 10,000 on the east steps of the nation's capital. Truett preached his eloquent sermon entitled Baptists and Religious Liberty, a powerful defense of and justification for religious freedom and separation of church and state. In one defining passage of that sermon at the Capitol, Truett proclaimed, "Our contention is not for mere toleration, but for absolute liberty." Toleration, he continued, is a concession, while liberty is a right. Toleration is a matter of expediency, while liberty is a matter of principle. Toleration is a gift from government, while liberty is a gift from God. Our second in a series of profiles of Texas Baptists who made a difference concerns a woman who pioneered missions for Texas Baptists. At 12, Ann Luther publicly committed to obey God's call to go to the foreign mission field. In 1878, at 19, she was elected secretary of the newly organized Texas Home Mission Society. In October 1880, she and the Society's president, Fanny Breedlove Davis, organized a meeting in Austin at which the Women's Missionary Union, WMU, of Texas was born. Soon after, the Foreign Mission Board appointed Ann Luther Southern Baptist's first missionary to Brazil and Texas Baptist's first woman foreign missionary. The 1936 book Centennial Story of Texas Baptists states that it was her willingness to serve in Brazil that focused the interest of Texas Baptist women on foreign missions. Ann Luther and her new husband, W.B. Bagby, soon sailed for Brazil. According to the Texas State Historical Association, the Bagbys served as missionaries supported by Texas Baptists for 61 years, the longest tenure of any Southern Baptist missionaries, and had 5 children who followed them into missionary service to South America. Ann Luther Bagby's influence extended to education as well. By 1910, a school founded to educate and train Baptist women for Christian service, known as the Southwestern Training School, was operating as part of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. According to Centennial Story of Texas Baptists, Ann Luther Bagby, while on one of her furloughs to the States, proposed that the Texas WMU provide a scholarship to the Southwestern Training School to the woman graduate earning the highest grade in Bible study at each Texas Baptist school. Her proposal was adopted. Today's Texas Baptist who made a difference took his time getting here. Freeman Smalley, according to the Texas State Historical Association, was born in Pennsylvania in 1790 and grew up in Ohio. He had already become a Baptist by the time he enlisted in the Army and fought in the War of 1812. After the war, he started preaching, and eventually, in 1817, his church ordained him to the gospel ministry. In 1822, while visiting cousins in Pecan Point, Texas, he preached to the community there, becoming, most historians believe, the first Baptist minister to ever preach in Texas. But Smalley didn't move to Texas for good until about 1848. 2 years earlier, his son had moved just south of what today is Round Rock, Texas. So Smalley Sr. sold his land in Illinois, where he had started a church in his home in 1834, and followed his son to Texas. Smalley preached wherever he could, but found it hard to hold a congregation in Texas because he preached against slavery, no doubt stepping on the toes of slave owners and causing them to seek a friendlier preacher. In 1849, he boldly organized the first anti-slavery Baptist church in Texas, Union Baptist Church in Williamson County. Union Baptist Church indeed. Years later, during the Civil War, Smalley remained in Texas, but stood foursquare in support of the Union cause. For this, he was robbed, and his family faced constant threats. Today, a historical marker marks the site of the anti-slaveholding Union Baptist Cemetery in Williamson County near Round Rock. The marker notes that the cemetery has also been referred to as Smalley Cemetery because of its connections with Freeman Smalley's family, and that Freeman Smalley Jr. is believed to have been the first person buried there in 1849. In Texas Baptist, a sesquicentennial history, Leon Macbeth writes that with the arrival of Zacharias N. Morrell in Texas in 1835, the future of Texas Baptist was assured. Born in South Carolina, grew up in Tennessee, but Z. N. Morrell read reports on Texas in the Tennessee Baptist News Journal and was excited about the prospects for Baptist work here. He preached his first sermon in Texas on December 30th, 1835, to about 40 fellow Tennesseans camped in East Texas. A few weeks later, after preaching a fiery sermon from Isaiah in the center of Nacogdoches, he headed back to Tennessee to get his family and bring them to Texas. In early April, as they drew near to Texas, they were warned that danger awaited them, following Santa Anna's capture of the Alamo and murderous sweep through Texas. Morrell wrote later, "Trusting God, we traveled on. Within days came the news that Sam Houston had defeated Santa Anna at San Jacinto." Macbeth tells us that Morrell traveled extensively, preaching, baptizing converts, forming churches. He sums up Morrell's contribution with these words: "In almost 50 years in Texas, Morrell laid solid Baptist foundations. When churches were formed, he was there. He helped form the first association, the first state convention. Morrell valued schools and was a major factor in the formation and early promotion of Baylor University. However, Morrell was primarily a frontier missionary preacher who, while riding the missionary circuit in central Texas, often had to cross swollen rivers because there were no ferries or bridges." Thomas Buford Maston. Our focus today is on T.B. Maston's teaching and activism. In 1920, coming from Carson Newman College in Tennessee, he enrolled in Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth. In 1923, as he was nearing graduation, he was asked by L.R. Scarborough, Southwestern's president, to stay and teach at the seminary. My dad, Jace Jones, a Maston student and friend, told the story of T.B. Maston and his family in a 1999 address that is now published on the website of the T.B. Maston Foundation at www.tbmaston.org. Dr. Maston began his teaching career in the field of religious education, but he was eventually appointed to teach courses in Christian ethics. When the Department of Christian Ethics was established, he was named chair and remained chair until his retirement in 1963. Truly, T.B. Maston transformed the field of Christian ethics into one that challenged not only students, but Christians far and wide to walk as Jesus walked. My dad wrote that Dr. Maston was not only a teacher, lecturer, and writer in the field of Christian ethics, he was an activist. He led Southern Baptists to face the racial situation and to consider the biblical teachings and principles. That took courage, for there was bitterly strong opposition to this kind of teaching and activity. One day in his office he pointed to a file cabinet. "That bottom drawer," he said, "is full of hate mail. You would be surprised at the language in those letters and some of the people who wrote them." This was also a time when American labor was struggling for a stronger standing. Maston's fair and sympathetic presentation of labor's needs and rights aroused opposition in some quarters. Some have called T.B. Maston the conscience of Baptists in the 20th century, and rightly so. We can't talk about Thomas Buford Maston without including his wife, Essie Mae McDonald Maston, whom he affectionately called Mommy, and their family. As I mentioned Friday, my dad, Jace Jones, a Maston student and friend, told their story in a 1999 address that is now published on the T.B. Maston Foundation website. Dr. Maston, he wrote, was a family man. His life was centered around his wife and their two sons, Thomas McDonald, known as Tom Mack, and Gene. In 1920, T.B. Maston and Essie Mae McDonald enrolled in Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth. They married the following summer, and both stayed at the seminary to teach following graduation in 1923. Tom Mack was born in 1925, and Gene was born in 1928. Mrs. Maston retired and sacrificed a promising teaching career to take care of her family. Tom Mack was disabled from birth, never had the use of his arms or legs, never was able to speak, totally dependent on others, communicating only through facial expressions, distinctive grunts, and occasional twisting and turning of his body. In an era in which such persons were typically institutionalized, Dr. and Mrs. Maston insisted on keeping him at home. They fed him, dressed him, took care of all of his needs, but treated him fully as a person with dignity and loving care. And he was a person. Tom Mack, my dad wrote, had an attractive personality of his own and a wonderfully warm and bright smile. Yesterday I mentioned that the Maston's oldest son, Tom Mack, was disabled from birth. My dad, Jace Jones, recalled watching Dr. Maston at dinner as he held up Tom Mack's head with one hand while feeding him spoonful by spoonful with the other, and going to their home on a hot day while Dr. Maston was cutting the grass, keeping Tom Mack in the shade where he could watch the cars and people go by. Daddy also told of a time when the Mastons were visiting. He and Dr. Maston had gone to church while Mother and Mrs. Maston stayed home with Tom Mack. Mother said that Tom Mack stayed expressionless while Daddy and Dr. Maston were gone, but as soon as they returned and Tom Mack heard Dr. Maston's voice, the voice of his daddy, he straightened up and brightened markedly. When Tom Mack, 62 years old, passed away in the fall of 1987, a Maston neighbor remarked, "How marvelous that God can use a man who never spoke a word to touch so many lives." Dr. Maston died about 6 months after Tom Mack's death. Gene Maston spent most of his adult life in the Northeast, where he started campus ministries on numerous college campuses. He also taught a magnet school in New York that provided innovative education to African American students who were struggling at conventional schools. And he did all of this while suffering from diabetes and chronic clinical depression. Gene died in December 2002, just a few months after his mother's death. T.B. and Essie Mae Maston, even if they had done nothing else, served God remarkably as loving, caring parents who set an example of service and humility.